and remember which one it is to get started on this. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background on invasion biology and what an invasive species means. And this is typically for a general audience or even people who are kind of being introduced to invasive species. It's helpful, even if you know a lot about invasive species, to kind of go through what it means at the state of Minnesota and in particular at the Department of Agriculture. And so we talk about invasive species as a plant or insect or any kind of animal as well that's introduced and non-native. And typically they're moved by human activities to a location where they don't naturally occur. And then the other piece of it is that they cause ecological or economic problems. So non-native species that are in North America, for example, I guess something like dandelion, we don't consider invasive because it's really doesn't cause a lot of ecological problem, at least from our perspective. People who prefer perfect lawns, of course, are going to want to get rid of anything that's not grass, but that's a kind of a generalized example. And then also we talk about non-native. So an apple tree is a really good example of something non-native, but it's not invasive. Buckthorn causes harm and is non-native. Emerald ash borer is also another one. And then we have poison ivy, that's a native species, but it's not considered invasive, even though I'll talk a little bit later about it being on our noxious weed list. So it's certainly a poison or problematic plant in a lot of ways. So we do consider different stages of invasion as well. New or not present or things that we don't believe are in the state of Minnesota or North America generally. Emerging species. Oops, I think I have it. Oh yeah, here we go. So new or not present is not in the state. So something like giant hogweed, which you may have heard of, it ends up in the news every once in a while because it is present in the state of Pennsylvania, where they're working pretty hard to eradicate it. We don't think we have it in the state of Minnesota, but so new and not present. Emerging, a species that's present but not widely distributed. So something like brownleaf bittersweet. There's not a lot of it, or it's kind of contained to the eastern part of the state. So things of that nature. But the things like buckthorn that are widely established and present in a lot of different areas. So we talk a lot about an invasion curve when we talk about invasive plants or invasive insects. And this is kind of a guide we've used in the past for figuring out some management strategies or what a good time might be for different types of treatments for different species of plants. So in that sort of early stage at the left, where we're looking at the lower part of the black line, that's where we usually consider something to be pretty manageable, even maybe able to eradicate from the landscape. But once it really starts ramping up and reaching larger populations that are widespread, those are where we are looking at different strategies to manage, maybe just something like mowing once a year to keep it from seeds from spreading or something like that. So we do look at that kind of invasion curve as well, what we would call an invasion curve. So again, in Minnesota, we do actually have a definition that's defined for the state. It's a non-native species that can naturalize and cause harm to the environment economic harm or harm to human health, or it may threaten natural resources. Oh, sorry. Threaten natural resources. So sometimes we use I don't work with aquatic species, but sometimes we use examples of aquatic species because people are familiar with zebra mussels, and this is a good example of what zebra mussels can do. And then the species on here, garlic mustard, most people are pretty familiar with in Minnesota, since there's lots of efforts to do garlic mustard pulls in the spring, or weed them, bag them up, and try to get them out of the landscape before they flower and go to seed. And then just kind of briefly talking about some of the consequences of invasive species. We sort of break it out into different areas in ecology and recreation and economics. And ecological damages, they can cause changes in structure and habitats and disturbance. Something like a buckthorn invasion to an oak savanna that suppresses native species from growing, and so then you end up with nothing but buckthorn in areas. Out in some western states, they've got some invasive grass species that are fire promoters and increasing fire frequency. So we do look at some of that and kind of consider what the risks might be to Minnesota for some of those species as well. There's changes in resources, such as excessive users of resources like tamarisk. Tamarisk is another species it's grown in Minnesota, but it hasn't shown, or it hasn't naturalized that we know of. But out in Colorado and some other western states, there's been a lot of tamarisk that have taken over some river areas, and so tamarisk can lower water tables and add salt to the soil and water. So it's a really very devastating plant. And then something like black locust, which is on our noxious weed list, can add nitrogen to the soil as well. So there's different types of changing or resource changes that can happen. And then, of course, what we talk about a lot, as well as changes in plant diversity and landscape diversity due to species that are able to take over an area. And so why do we care? There's lots of reasons why we care. Just general, all of these species are ones that are in Minnesota. We really want to promote and try to attain a more diverse landscape, whether it's along MnDOT right-of-ways where they've worked on re-landscaping areas to include more native seed mixes, or DNR's prairie restoration areas, even home backyards that have more diverse landscapes. We want to try to attain more of that across Minnesota. For recreation, there's lots of other impacts as well to hunting and hiking. The top picture on the right is one that has a lot of bittersweet vines growing in it, and those kinds of plants can create almost like a wall of plant material that things or animals can't get through. Humans even have a hard time getting through. So there are some things that can cause barriers like that, physical barriers. And as far as things that people like to do for hobbies, like bird watching and wildflower watching, as part of a recreation, invasive species can impact that as well. And there are some health impacts as well. There are things like deer ticks that are starting to increase in population in areas where there are invasive shrubs that are creating a layer that contains enough humidity and moisture that the ticks really thrive in. And so that kind of impact as well, when you have lots of invasive shrubs, are important for knowing about invasive impacts of invasive plants. And as far as economics, some of this data is a little old, but I think it still has an impact. It was estimated back in 2000 that the damage and control costs could be around $138 billion each year. I think that is a lot larger than that, but it still is something to think about, that we don't have good numbers. We don't talk about it a lot, but there are pretty big economic impacts. There's losses for landowners and land managers as well, through a number of different ways. Certainly increased management. If you have a lot of buckthorn, for example, that you're spending thousands of dollars on clearing from your land. Timber production, it's estimated that emerald ash borer could cause billions of dollars in timber loss in Minnesota. There's a loss of species regeneration. There's loss of rangeland for cattle from leafy spurge or thistle as well. So with all these impacts, invasive species can destroy the diversity of spring flowers. When you have invasive shrub species that are coming in, then we lose a lot of our native shrubs that produce berries for animals. And there's an effect on the timber industry as well, when you have species like buckthorn that take over. The other thing too, we don't have a program specific to removing buckthorn, but it is a host to soybean aphid that can affect the food, or its potential to affect the food industry if there were a lot of buckthorn around soybean fields, soybean aphid. Buckthorn is also a host to soybean rust, which is a disease. So there are some concerns in some of the western part of the state about a lot of buckthorn potentially taking over. And then, of course, recreation could be impaired as well with those kinds of impacts. And then we end up talking a lot about introduction pathways. And by that, we mean how these invasive plants and insects come into Minnesota and into the US, but we focus primarily on Minnesota. Ornamental plants and seeds, unfortunately, are one of the big pathways, I guess I would say. And as being a horticulturist by training, it does kind of break my heart a little bit when I hear about more ornamental plants that are spreading and kind of taking over areas. But luckily for us in Minnesota, the nursery industry and the horticultural industry has been really responsive to the species we've added to the noxious weed list. So we've been able to work pretty well with them on making sure that any plant species we deem as invasive are being either taken off sale or managed. There are seed mixes seed mixes, but also things can come in on agriculture equipment, that particularly on those that are like harvesting companies that come in and from out of state and harvest for the large grain growers. There's also some wildlife seed mixes, plant mixes that are used for erosion have historically had some species that are now considered invasive in them, but for the most part, again, working with the different entities that use these kind of mixes has been very effective in making sure they are aware of that. Seeds carried in water or soil from elsewhere. Sometimes companies that come in or get contract work for doing construction projects may have contaminated soil or something. It's really hard to, I guess I would say, enforce or try to prevent that from happening. I do know that some like the Department of Transportation in some counties have started to write in their specs for contractors that they clean any equipment before they bring it into a new work site. So there is some precedence around trying to prevent some of that from spreading and moving around. And then seeds carried by livestock. If farmers are bringing livestock in from other states, I guess with having drought years, we've had more hay coming in from other states. I'm not sure. I haven't really heard anything on movement of any kind of invasive species through that pathway at this point, but it is a risk that we're concerned about. Mowing along roadsides, it's common to find examples of something that's growing along a roadside that's been mowed, and then 20 feet down the road, you see another patch of it. So again, that's another kind of working with different entities to make sure there's better protocol in place for mowing to prevent moving stuff. And then wildlife, of course, a couple good examples are buckthorn that gets spread by seed when birds eat it and move it around. Bittersweet's another one. So those kind of species that have fruit that are ingested and then fly or moved along and then go out the other end. Those kinds of plant species that are moved by wildlife too are a concern. So we do try to target some species. We call them early detection. They're species that have a high invasive potential and a limited distribution, and eradication is possible. So I'll talk a little bit more about specific species later on, but we do work on trying to make sure there are some, or that those species that have limited distribution we have more focus on those. But you could try to get mulch that is made in Minnesota, I guess. It's probably my best answer.
May I say, the mulch store in Rosemont, and I think Norton's as well, has a program where they heat it to a certain temperature. So, and it's certified by somebody. I've seen a whole presentation on it. So you have to be careful, but you do need to ask.
Right. Good. Yeah. Yeah. And that's close enough to you all in Dakota County that should be easy enough to get to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some statutes and weed law stuff, and I'll try not to get too into the law stuff. It's kind of dense and not the most exciting stuff, but it is kind of important to just at least have some context about how we operate on the noxious weeds and invasive plants for the Department of Ag in Minnesota. So we have a number of statutes that dictate the noxious weed law. It's set up to really protect the residents of Minnesota from the injurious effects of noxious weeds on public health, the environment, public roads, crops, livestock, and other property. And it does apply to all persons owning land in the state, including state agencies such as the Department of Agriculture, or sorry, Department of Agriculture doesn't own any land, Department of Transportation, and Department of Natural Resources. So federal owners of land too, like Fish and Wildlife or Department of Defense. So it does, and private citizens, of course. So it does apply to everybody in the state. There are no exemptions. And again, it protects residents from the injurious effects of noxious weeds. So county agriculture inspectors are the local enforcement people. They for the noxious weed law. And so it's kind of a unique relationship where the Department of Ag oversees the noxious weed law and everything within those statutes, but we don't do the enforcement. So the county ag inspectors do enforcement of the noxious weed law. And they do a lot of coordination with townships and municipalities. For Dakota County, Todd Matzke, he works with the SWCD. And I've worked with him for a number of years on different invasive or noxious weeds for Dakota County. He's been great and really responsive. They'll also consult with the county attorney because any enforcement action would have to go through the county attorney before anything is started. So it's very county oriented. County ag inspector also would conduct any site investigations. If there's a complaint or a report, they'll serve as the point of contact for noxious weed issues. And then they're also the lead contact for any weed biocontrol agents. So Department of Ag does rely on county ag inspectors and local weed inspectors to enforce this noxious weed law. The duties that the county ag inspectors are responsible for include enforcement provisions, and this is also a lot of weed law, statute stuff, point of contact. For example, a local weed inspector, which could be your city or township weed inspector. There are a number of them. I don't work a lot with local weed inspectors since we go through the county for that, but they also are supposed to examine land in their jurisdiction, make sure weed law is complied with, and see that control and eradication is carried out. In addition to their core duties, county ag inspectors are also setting up trainings for townships and municipalities. They are posting a general weed notice by May 15th of each year. If they're able and have time, they'll conduct seasonal weed tours with their townships, municipalities, investigating weed complaints, consulting with landowners in the violation of the law, in serving individual weed notices to landowners if it gets to that point, and then coordinating any kind of cooperative weed management agreements that may come out of the enforcement process. There are a few key things too for their official authority. County ag inspectors do have a right to enter land for inspections. They also will order control of noxious weeds if it gets to the point where the landowner doesn't do anything about noxious weeds. They can start the order for that. And then the Commissioner of Agriculture provides training to county ag inspectors as well. So the enforcement process, again, just kind of so that you're have a little bit of context for this. We do encourage a lot of prevention and outreach ahead of any kind of enforcement action, identifying issues, implementing actions, starting an enforcement process if everything else has been done, such as outreach and talking with landowner, and whatever else, identifying species, if everything else is done and the landowner still doesn't take action, then enforcement may be started. So along with that, records are kept on what's happened and the enforcement process as well. So there's, oops, these are the same, that's the same slide. Sorry. I just went over that one. So there are some counties that have their own county noxious weeds as well. I forgot to look to see if Dakota County has their own. I don't think they do, but if there's a species that is not on the noxious weed list that the county deems to be a problem, they can put it on their own noxious weed list and manage it as they would if it were on the official state noxious weed list. So there are 10 or 12, I think, counties that have their own noxious weed lists as well. Again, I put this in here to make sure that people are aware that there is something else besides the state noxious weed list to be aware of. So the noxious weed list, when we talk about it, what we mean by it is that it's a noxious weed that's a regulated plant species. We have our website keeps the current list updated. The county can add one as well. There are 4 different categories on the noxious weed list: prohibited, eradicate, prohibited, control, restricted, and specially regulated. And then I think it's also important to know that we do have a pretty, a pretty strict process. I don't know if strict is the right word. We do have a process for adding species to the noxious weed list that goes through the state noxious weed advisory committee. And this committee is made up of a lot of different entities. The committee evaluates plant species. There's members from U of M and all the state agencies, couple tribal nations, forest industries, the Association of Townships, the counties, the League of Cities. So there's a lot of entities that have a lot of input on this committee. And the committee will advise the Commissioner of Agriculture regarding responsibilities under the Noxious Weed Control Program, evaluate species, develop weed categories for listing species, develop management criteria for each weed category, recommend where on the list that a species should go if it should be on the noxious weed list, and then reevaluating species every 3 years. So hopefully you can see this okay. The risk assessment process and listing process is this is what goes through the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. We do get a few or a handful of petitions each year of species that people think should be added to the noxious weed list. And those petitions can come from any resident of Minnesota. So we have a form you can fill out to help us, to provide some information to help us give or help us decide if it should be evaluated or not. So once a petition is accepted, it will be added to our list of species that need to have a risk assessment written for them. And then after sometimes takes a few years for a species to get a risk assessment completed, but like I said, every year we add a couple more species to our list, so it sort of kind of keeps rolling and rolling. So the risk assessment's a pretty thorough review of a lot of different research and literature that's available, as well as uh, stuff like personal communication with people in other states that maybe have worked with the species in the past. So they do and they take the risk assessments take a while to write, just because we try to be as thorough as possible with either limited information if there's not much out there, or a lot of information. So so it's our way of trying to make sure that any species that ends up on the noxious weed list has a lot of that kind of research and backing to show that it's a risk to the state. So the Commissioner of Agriculture has the final decision on whether a species is listed or not. So if the risk assessment is that it's recommending to be added to one of those categories on the noxious weed list, then the commissioner reviews all that and decides if it should, yes, be added, or no, not be added. So the commissioner has the final say on that. Things that we look at for the risk assessment include the native range and distribution of the species, the establishment and spread, the threat to Minnesota, for example, if it's a toxic plant or not, or what if it's toxic to animals or not, different things like that. Beneficial qualities, and even the likelihood of being able to manage or control it are considered as well for the risk assessment. So with that, are there any questions on that kind of law stuff? Which I know that's kind of a quick overview of some kind of complex things, but I'm happy to answer anything before going into emerging noxious weeds.
There were two questions that I think we could address. Does the noxious weed law statute apply to neighbors that have invasive species, i.e. buckthorn, in their yard and refuse to remove it?
Well, the category that buckthorn is under does not require people to remove it from their land. Unfortunately, it's a category that keeps buckthorn from being sold in the state. So if somebody's got it growing on their property, there's nothing that can really be done about it unless your city or township has a specific ordinance for it that is stronger than what our noxious weed law is.
The second question is, are noxious weeds mostly annuals or perennials?
That's a good question. They're mostly perennials. There are Palmer amaranth is one of the annuals. There are a fair number of biennials, but most of them are perennials. So yeah, that's a good question. And that makes kind of, when we talk about, I don't talk a lot about management of noxious weeds or invasive plants, but when we do give talks on that, that's an important distinction to know, as well as if they're perennials or annuals or biennials.
So there's a follow-up question about buckthorn. What is the category of buckthorn?
It's in the restricted noxious weed.
Okay, thank you. I believe that's all that I have here. So thank you.
I think there's one more that just came into the chat.
Oh yes.
Sally.
Yep, Japanese, I guess the real question is, if it's on the list that has to be removed, well, let me read the question. If someone has Japanese knotweed growing on the land, are they required to remove it? And are there professionals that will do this, and what types of costs, I guess the question is.
Yeah, so knotweed falls under the prohibited control category, and that category means you have to keep it from spreading, which for knotweed is pretty challenging. Uh, I would have to ask around about specific companies that remove it, or manage it. Off the top of my head, can't think of any. You could ask Todd Matsky with the SWCD if he has any recommendations as well. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but
could you repeat his name, maybe spell it for us?
Sure. Yep. Todd, Todd.
Got that. Yep.
Matsky is, I think it's MATS.
Oh, KY maybe.
K. There's a Z in there.
Okay. And what's the agency again?
The Dakota County Soil and Water Conservation District.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, that's in the same building with and extension and farming.
Oh,
and we'll
good.
talk to them about that.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, knotweed's pretty challenging. You may be kind of limited to herbicide use or herbicide applications for it. I don't know that you can really dig it. I mean, you can't really dig it up by hand because it can have really long roots. The one thing I have heard from some people who've worked with it in St. Paul is that smothering it with black plastic has been successful. But you'd have to it's a thicker kind of black plastic. I can't remember the thickness of it, but and you have to cover kind of a large area with it to make sure that anything isn't kind of like popping out the side of the black plastic, if that makes sense. But they've had to leave it for, I think, at least 2 seasons, all the whole time. So, if you don't want an unsightly spot covered with black plastic for 2 or 3 years, you might not want it, but it has been successful, and I can get you in touch with the county person in Ramsey County as well for that.
Is that the soil and water person in Ramsey County as then?
No, he's with the Ramsey Parks and Rec. His name is Justin Townsend.
And he's with Ramsey Parks and Rec?
Yes.
Okay.
So smothering, as far as I talked to him a year or two ago about it, had been working really well on knotweed.
Okay. So he's the expert on smothering knotweed. Okay.
Yep.
I'm making a note of that. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, we got the Todd Matsky. Very good. Well done. TZKE. Thank you. Well, it helps to know how to spell. Great. Okay. Are there any other questions that people want to put in the chat before we wrap this up? I'm not sure that this was the most pleasant of conversations to have at the beginning of the year, but it's certainly important.
Yeah. I just have a few more slides left. So I know it's kind of one of those things. It can be a little overwhelming sometimes too, but there are a few. So last year in 2023, we added a bunch of plants to the noxious weed list. And so we tend to only add species every 3 years so that we try to keep the list stable for a few years at least to make sure people have time to, or they're not overwhelmed every year with new species, basically, is our goal with that. And so prohibited noxious weeds, these are plants that are known to be detrimental to the human health, environment, public roads, crops, livestock, or other property. And we do have 2 regulatory listings for the prohibited noxious weeds. They fall under eradicate or control. And eradicate species are the ones that are either not known to be present or are not widely established. So the law for for prohibited eradicate is that these species must be eradicated, and that means that all of the above and below ground parts of the plant must be destroyed, or killed, basically. And then in addition, no transportation, propagation, or sale of these plants is allowed. So there's also measures that are taken to prevent and exclude these species from being introduced into Minnesota. And last year we added 3 species to the eradicate list: Johnson grass, pale swallowwort, and red hailstone. Red hailstone is probably of interest to Dakota County because there was some found in Farmington in 2022, I believe it was. So it's on the eradicate list. As far as I know, the property managers have been pretty diligent in hiring a company to do some spraying and monitoring and things like that to make sure that it is getting taken care of. But the red hailstone kind of pops up every once in a while. I think it has a tuber on it, so I think it can be used as a food crop, maybe. I'm not sure. I've never eaten it, though. That's why it kind of seems like it pops up in odd places sometimes and it's not spread by birds or whatever. Pale swallowwort's related to black swallowwort, which has been on the list for a long time. And then Johnson grass is one of those that's not known to be in the state, but it's pretty problematic in a lot of other states. I've never seen it before, so I don't know what exactly it looks like, but it's a grass, so spreads aggressively. It may be toxic to livestock. And then again, the pale swallowwort's a vine that is related to black swallowwort. If you ever see a vining milkweed, make sure to let somebody know or take pictures of it and send it to either Extension or SWCD so that we can try to identify it, because we do not have any native vining milkweeds. And so it's very possible it's one of these invasive ones if you find a vine that's got milkweed pods on it. And then this red hailstone, like I mentioned earlier, is actually already in Dakota County, but as far as I know, it's been pretty well managed. So I don't think we can call it eradicated yet, but it does form these underground tubers. They kind of look like potatoes. So it's difficult to kill because it's got all these underground storage for it. It is kind of pretty though when it's in bloom. On the control list, so the prohibited control means that these species have to be kept from spreading into new areas. So this is where something like the knotweeds, where if they're on a property and it is going under a fence or onto the next property, that's technically in violation of the law. So you have to keep it from spreading or producing new seeds and dispersing it in new areas. So it's a challenging one for species that produce a lot of seed. It's hard to manage. And then we did have 3 that moved into this category from the eradicate list, which It's not unusual for us to move categories around or move species around in categories, but it does not happen very often. So meadow knapweed, which I don't think it's mostly in northern Minnesota. Poison hemlocks kind of all around the state. And then roundleaf bittersweet, which used to be called oriental bittersweet, is now on the control list as well. Meadow knapweed, limited mostly to northern Minnesota. Poison hemlocks, very toxic. We see this pop up in more wet areas along ditches or stream banks and things like that. Rochester's had in the past quite a bit of it around as well. And then roundleaf bittersweet is one of those destructive woody vines where it can girdle trees that it's growing around. It does have very showy fruit and those yellow capsules on the ends as well. So it seems like every year some of it shows up in holiday vine or holiday wreath or holiday decoration stuff. So our nursery staff that we have at the Department of Agriculture usually handles those kinds of sales of things that show up in we call it holiday greenery. So it seems like every year we end up kind of dealing with this, but at least most people are kind of aware of what that is. And then the restricted group, these are widely distributed. They still are detrimental to human health or animal health. But the only feasible means of control is to prevent their spread by prohibiting importation, sale, or transportation of their propagating parts. So this is a pretty big category. Garlic mustard, the buckthorns around here, crown vetch, which was historically used along roadsides a lot for bank stabilization, a whole bunch of shrubby honeysuckles, Queen Anne's lace is on here. Winged burning bush is one that is a newer one. So this group here are the ones that were added in 2023. And burning bush is probably the one that we hear the most about. It was pretty widely used as a landscape plant, but I've seen at Great River Bluff State Park down by Winona, they had, I think, something like 13 acres of burning bush that had naturalized up along this hillside. And it was really shocking to see because it was all just like all these seedlings and mature plants and just like, how did this even happen? It was like buckthorn, like the new buckthorn kind of. So, so I guess it wasn't surprising that it ended up being on the list. So it's been removed from sale, and nurseries are not allowed to bring it into the state. That does not mean that they have to, that landowners have to remove it from their lawns or anything like that. You know, in most city landscapes or lawns or whatever, or areas where it's growing next to a lawn where it's getting mowed a lot, it's probably not going to be a huge problem, but I have seen a few naturalized burning bush plants in some parks around Bloomington. So I know it's starting to happen in around the metro area in some park areas too. So silvergrass is a grass, does form large monocultures and grows really densely. Don't know that we have that much of it that's naturalized in Minnesota at this point. Lesser celandine is another one that we only know of a few populations of it. St. Paul Parks has some that I know of. And then burning bush that I talked a little bit already. it does also produce a lot of seed. I was going to mention that. So you can see the flowers in that picture, the really pale kind of greenish colored flowers, but it does produce a lot of fruit as well. And then the last category is the specially regulated. In this category, this category has a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of species, but it's got species plants that have really specific, most of them have really specific labeling regulations on them. And those are specific management plans as well. So it's a category where there's landscape plants and then or something like poison ivy that we can't outright, put on the noxious weed list, but can have some sort of regulation on it that helps people. So the 3 that were added to the specially regulated list last year, Amur cork tree, Callery pear, and Tatarian maple. Amur cork tree, the regulation is that only named male cultivars can be sold in Minnesota. So it's an odd one, but it's comes down to the nursery inspector group that regulates that. So most consumers probably won't even know or have any idea that, there are some cultivars that we can't buy here. Callery pear is one that has a 3-year production phase out for the nursery industry. So there's a handful of nurseries that still have Callery pear that they have in containers. And because of the economic cost of what they have on stock, they would lose a lot of money if we were to just ban it. So they have a chance to try to sell them before they are banned from sale. And then Tatarian maple has a labeling restriction on it, or labeling requirement on it, that states something like at the point of sale that this species should only be planted in a managed landscape, or something like it can't be planted within 100 yards of a natural area to keep it from spreading into natural areas, if that makes sense. It's kind of a confusing one. Just a few pictures of the species. It is the Amur cork tree is a prolific seed producer. Callery pear. When I was in college years and years ago, this is one of those species that I always kind of wondered why people even bought it, because it was so ugly and not a not a very nice landscape plant, in my opinion. And in the States, there's eastern states where this was planted a lot in, like for boulevard trees, but also I think just in developments and things. And the only time of year it kind of looks nice is when it's flowering, but the rest of the year it just sort of looks like crap. And and now it's kind of, it has naturalized in eastern states, and those are the states that are saying get rid of it if you can. Don't let people plant it. Don't let it get established. So it does fill in quickly. So it's a very problematic plant. And then Tatarian maple again has that labeling requirement on it. Just like Amur maple, it produces a lot of seed and can form pretty dense stands of just Tatarian maple. Unfortunately, it does look nice in both the summer and fall, but as long as it's kept out of some of those natural areas, it hopefully, fingers crossed, won't become too big of a problem. And so again, this is just the summary of the species that were added to the noxious weed list in 2023. We have all the species pages available at the Department of Ag website. And then the species that changed category in 2023, which you may or may not, or it may be important or not to you. And then just some links and references for you if you'd like. They're not the easiest ones to write down or whatever, but I believe I did send my PowerPoint to you, so the links to the references should be in that as well. And with that, that's what I have, and happy to answer more questions.
There are more. We'll start with the bottom because it's the funniest. So, Emilie, what is the noxious weed you despise the most?
I really don't like knotweeds. That's one. Knotweeds, and I don't like the bittersweet very much either. I had to work with it quite a bit, and I had to work with it so much actually that because the way it twines up plants or trees and things, I used to have like nightmares about it, like strangling me, I guess. So the bittersweet is also at the top of my list, I think, for most hated weeds.
I have two others. Is Vinca vine on any of the lists? I didn't see it, but I know there's longer lists on the website.
No, we have okay, I'm trying to think if we evaluated it last year, and I believe it was not going to be recommended to be added to the list, if I remember correctly. So there's an evaluation, but it has not been made public yet. So I think there's a couple of things. If you believe it should be added, you could contact me or send me an email or a note or something about it. Or you can contact Todd Matsky too about that to see if he would add it, or he would bring that forward to everybody. I'm trying to remember. I know it was meant to be evaluated, but now I can't remember if it was completed or not yet.
And there's another one, Archangel Lamium.
Oh, yep. And that's another one on our list to evaluate. So that has not been completed either.
So what you're really saying is we should start avoiding those things, to get ahead of it.
Well, yeah, it's hard to say whether they'll be added to the noxious weed list for regulation or not, but they are ones to be, and the state does not maintain like a watch list or a recommendation of what you should not plant, if that makes sense. The DNR, I think, might have more of a invasive species list that's not regulated, but yeah, I'd say if you're concerned about it, might be best to avoid it. Or if you're seeing information from other states about it, it might be best to not plant them at this point. That doesn't mean they'll be added, but
right.
Yeah.
But we know they're a concern. And then this question has been asked twice actually, and it's a toughie. How do I get rid of Canadian thistle for good?
I have personally had success with it where along some fence lines where we first mowed it right as it was flowering, and then followed up later on, like a month or two after, treating anything that was growing with a broadleaf herbicide, and that surprisingly did a really good job to knock it back, so that the second year, I think I just had to follow up with a little bit of spot treating with herbicide. So that is kind of the, so I guess that's my recommendation, is to cut or mow while it's flowering before it goes to seed, and then follow up with herbicide spot treating on anything that's growing back. Seems that worked really, really well. Like, I was surprised that it worked as well as it did,
That's
because
good.
then the grass that was there came back, and then I think we've kept mowing along those areas just a couple of times a year to keep things managed, but it's not required, I don't think. And the other interesting thing too, I'll throw out there, is that the DNR, where they've been working on a lot of large scale prairie restoration areas in different, like, more western part of the state, they're what they've seen is that they may have a flush of Canada thistle, right? Like, after they reseed an area, they might have a whole bunch of Canada thistle pop up. And what they've seen over time is that if they're managing for the prairie, like they do controlled burns, or they do pretty minimal weed control those first few years, just to make sure that the native plants have a chance to establish. Once native plants are established pretty well, the Canada thistle can't really compete with the native plants. So they do pretty minimal. They might have a plant here or there or whatever that they can just either cut or whatever, maybe dig it out, I guess. But they've had pretty good success with very minimal management once they've got native stuff established. So that's, I know, a big, broad scale, large scale management, but I think if you're thinking about it in terms of, okay, do I just have to pull it out every couple of years, or maybe spot treat it as I need, or cut it or mow it, there's different strategies for Canada thistle that can help. And it can be overwhelming because there's a lot out there, but like I said, at least along the fence lines with mowing and then following up with herbicide treatment actually worked really well.
Okay, I have someone asked about creeping bellflower. If it's on any of the lists.
No, but we have had petitions, the risk assessment petitions for it. So I think it's on our list to evaluate. I'm not sure when, maybe in the next couple of years, I think. But we haven't worked on it, or we haven't written a risk assessment for it yet, but we are aware of it.
And there's two more. Someone said, I wish I had never planted trumpet creeper. It is taking over my yard. And I don't know what that is exactly, but doesn't sound like you want to plant trumpet creeper. One very valid question is, different change of pace question is, how should noxious weeds be disposed of? If you're hand weeding or mowing, what to do with the clippings or plant material?
Oh, that's a great question. I was going to put a slide in about disposal. So there are 50 some species on the noxious weed list, I think. And any species that's on the noxious weed list is technically not supposed to go into your yard waste disposal. So, I guess the next best option, and that's for a number of reasons, because we don't want it spreading and going to new areas or whatever. So there are some things that can be done. We've recommended putting things in black plastic bags to solarize them. So you let them sit out in the sun and they kind of break down. A lot of times they kind of get mushy, or they dry out. And at that point, once the flowers or seeds, okay, I should step back. Anything that has fruit or seeds on it cannot go into your yard waste. So if you're out in the early spring cutting buckthorn and there is not any fruit on it, that can go into your yard waste. If you're pulling up anything else that does not have fruit or seed on it, then you can put that in your yard waste. The problem is when things do have fruit. So like if you do cut buckthorn and it's got all the little fruit on it, I do know people that have hand cut all the fruit off and then stuck the sticks into their yard waste. It works if you've got the time. You can like go back to the solarizing, put it in black plastic, and if it's got fruit or seeds on it, let it break down and dry out, or get mushy or whatever happens to it. At that point, you can, once it's degraded, you can throw it out. And then you can always, if you don't have burning restrictions, you can burn a lot of stuff once it dries out too. I know people who, burn buckthorn and lots of other different plant species once they've dried out. So burning's an option as well.
Great presentation. Thank you so much, Emilie, and lots of good questions out there. So we really appreciate the time you've spent with us tonight. And with that, I think we will say goodnight and let you go and say thanks again.
So anybody can email me at any time with any questions. Plant ID stuff, you can always take pictures and send it to us, and we'll do our best to